They left her to die in the desert, calling her worthless cargo. But beneath the scorching sun, Elena Martinez possessed a strength that could survive anything the frontier could throw at her. The wagon that had carried her from San Antonio had disappeared hours ago, leaving nothing but wheel tracks in the sand and the echo of cruel laughter. Her intended husband had taken one look at her weathered hands and sun-darkened skin, declared her unsuitable for a respectable household, and ordered the driver to leave her with nothing but the small leather satchel clutched against her chest. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of golden sand punctuated by sparse Joshua trees and distant purple mountains that shimmered like mirages in the afternoon heat. Elena's dark cotton dress, practical for travel but inadequate for the blazing sun, clung to her skin as perspiration beaded along her forehead. The silence was absolute except for the whisper of wind across the dunes and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Your comment helps our community grow stronger. Thanks, and let's get back to the story. Elena had always been told she was too practical, too independent, too willing to speak her mind for polite society. Her family's business had failed during the economic troubles, leaving her with education but no prospects, beauty that was considered too earthy, too real for the refined taste of potential suitors. The mail-order bride arrangement had seemed like providence, a chance to start fresh where her past wouldn't matter. Instead, it had led her to this moment of ultimate rejection, abandoned in a landscape as harsh and unforgiving as the judgment she had fled. Yet as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold, Elena did not sit down to wait for death. She had survived the loss of her family's fortune, the whispered gossip of San Antonio society, and the long, uncomfortable journey west. She would survive this too. Opening her satchel, she inventoried her meager possessions, a small flask of water, half empty now, a handful of hardtack, a worn Bible, and the pearl-handled knife her father had given her years ago, back when the Martinez family name still meant something. The desert evening brought a blessed coolness, and Elena began walking toward the mountains, following the North Star her father had taught her to find. Her leather boots, sturdy and practical, had been another mark against her in her intended husband's eyes. Now they carried her steadily across the sand, each step a quiet declaration of her refusal to surrender. It was Thomas Whitfield who found her the next morning, just after dawn painted the desert in soft pastels of rose and gold. Tom had been riding the boundary of his patrol area, following tracks that had gone cold days ago, when he spotted the small figure moving determinately across the landscape below. At 32, Tom was considered the least successful of the territorial rangers, the one who let criminals slip through his fingers and came back empty-handed, while other men brought in their quarry. His supervisor had made it clear that this assignment, patrolling the remote desert border, was both punishment and final chance. Tom's horse, a sturdy bay mare named Copper, picked her way carefully down the rocky slope toward the lone traveler. As they drew closer, Tom could make out the figure of a woman, her dark hair escaping from what had once been a neat bun, her dress torn and dusty but her posture unbowed. She heard his approach and turned to face him, one hand instinctively moving to the satchel at her side, her brown eyes alert and wary. "Ma'am," Tom said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was gentle and used to harsh commands or boastful declarations like the other rangers. "You're a long way from anywhere out here." Elena studied the man before her. He was lean and weathered, with kind eyes and hands that rested easily on his horse's reins rather than hovering near his weapon. Everything about him spoke of quiet competence rather than the swagger she had learned to distrust. "I was left here," she said simply, her voice steady despite the ordeal. "My intended husband found me unsuitable." The words hit Tom with unexpected force. He had heard variations of this story before, women discarded like unwanted merchandise when they failed to meet impossible expectations. But something in this woman's bearing, the way she stood straight despite obvious exhaustion, told him she was different from the broken souls he had occasionally encountered. "What's your name?" he asked, dismounting and offering her his water canteen. "Elena Martinez." She accepted the water gratefully but drank sparingly, a sign of desert wisdom that impressed him. "And you would be?" "Thomas Whitfield." "Tom." He hesitated, then added, "I'm a territorial ranger." "We're supposed to be." Elena caught the note of self-doubt in his voice, a familiar sound she recognized from her own inner conversations. "Supposed to be?" Tom looked away, toward the endless expanse of sand and rock. "Not very good at it, according to most folks. Been chasing the same group of cattle thieves for 3 months now, without much success." "Perhaps you're looking in the wrong places," Elena said, studying the landscape with practical eyes. "Thieves need water same as anyone else. They can't go far without it." It was such a simple observation, yet it struck Tom as profoundly insightful. In all his tracking, he had focused on following obvious trails, just as his training had taught him. But Elena was right. Water sources were limited in this harsh country. "There's a spring about 10 miles north of here," he said slowly, "hidden in a box canyon. I've never checked it because it seemed too obvious." "Sometimes the obvious answer is the right one," Elena replied. "We just convince ourselves it can't be that simple." Tom found himself studying this woman with growing respect. Abandoned in the desert, She was offering tactical advice to a ranger. There was steel beneath her exhausted exterior, a clarity of thought that his fellow rangers, for all their bluster, often lacked. "I can't leave you out here," he said. "There's a settlement about 20 miles southeast. I can take you there, help you figure out what comes next." Elena nodded, understanding that accepting help was not the same as admitting defeat. "I would be grateful for that kindness." As Tom helped her mount behind him on Copper, Elena noticed the careful way he checked her satchel was secure, how he adjusted his position to make the ride more comfortable for her. These were not the actions of a failed man, despite what others might say. They were the actions of someone who understood that true strength often showed itself in gentleness. The journey southeast took them through some of the most beautiful and treacherous country Elena had ever seen. Towering red rock formations carved by ancient winds rose from the desert floor like cathedrals, their surfaces alive with changing light as the sun moved across the sky. Tom proved to be a knowledgeable guide, pointing out safe paths through the rocky terrain and identifying the plants that stored precious water in their thick leaves. "You know this land well," Elena observed as they paused to rest in the shade of a massive boulder. "Spent more time riding through it than most, I suppose," Tom replied, offering her jerky from his saddlebags. "When you're not successful at bringing in criminals, you end up with plenty of time to explore. Or maybe," Elena said thoughtfully, "you understand something about this country that others don't. It's not the kind of place that gives up its secrets to force or impatience." Tom glanced at her, surprised by the insight. Most people saw his lack of quick arrest as failure, but Elena seemed to recognize something different in his approach. "My supervisor thinks I'm too cautious, too willing to study a situation instead of acting." "And what do you think?" The question caught Tom off guard. Few people had ever asked for his opinion about his own methods. "I think rushing into things gets people hurt," he said finally. "But that doesn't seem to count for much in my line of work." As they continued their journey, Elena found herself increasingly impressed by Tom's quiet competence. He read the desert like a book, knowing which paths would be solid underfoot and which might give way, where to find shade during the hottest part of the day, how to conserve water without becoming dangerously dehydrated. These were skills that spoke of deep understanding and patience, qualities that might not make for dramatic arrests, but would keep a person alive in harsh country. For his part, Tom was amazed by Elena's resilience and practical wisdom. She asked intelligent questions about their route, quickly learning to recognize the signs he pointed out. When they stopped to make camp as evening approached, she gathered firewood without being asked and proved surprisingly skilled at preparing a meal from their limited provisions. "You've done this before," Tom observed, watching her work. "My family had a small ranch outside San Antonio before we lost it," Elena explained, tending the small fire with practiced efficiency. "I learned to make do with whatever was available." "What happened to the ranch?" Elena was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. "Drought, mostly. Bad investments. My father was a good man but not much of a businessman. After he died, the creditors took everything." She looked up at Tom, her expression calm despite the painful memories. "That's when I answered the advertisement for a mail-order bride. Seemed like the only option left." Tom felt a surge of anger at the man who had abandoned her in the desert, but he kept his voice level. "His loss," he said simply. Elena smiled at that, the first genuine smile Tom had seen from her. It transformed her face, revealing a warmth and beauty that had nothing to do with conventional standards and everything to do with the strength of her spirit. "You're kind to say so." "It's not kindness," Tom replied. "It's truth." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged overhead, a brilliant canopy unmarred by city lights. The desert night was alive with subtle sounds, the distant call of a coyote, the rustle of small creatures moving through the brush, the whisper of wind through the rock formations. Elena found herself more at peace than she had been in months, despite the uncertainty of her situation. "Tell me about these cattle thieves you've been tracking," she said eventually. Tom stirred the fire with a stick, considering his words. "Smart group. They've been hitting ranches along the border, taking just enough cattle to be profitable, but not enough to provoke a major response. They know the country well, always seem to be one step ahead of us." "How many in the group?" "Best we can tell, 4 or 5 men. They work fast and clean, no unnecessary violence. Almost like they're trying to avoid attention rather than make a statement." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "That suggests they're not desperate men looking for quick money. They're organized, patient, probably planning to build up a substantial herd before moving it somewhere for sale." Tom looked at her with growing amazement. "You'd make a better ranger than half the men I work with." "I just think about what makes sense," Elena replied. "If I were stealing cattle, I want to minimize risk while maximizing profit. That water source you mentioned, the hidden spring. If they're using it as a base, they'd have everything they need, water for themselves and the cattle, concealment, and probably good grazing nearby." "We should check it out," Tom said, then caught himself. I should check it out. You'll be safe in town." Elena met his eyes steadily. "I have nowhere else to go, Tom. No money, no prospects, no one waiting for me. If there's a chance I could help you succeed in your work, maybe that's worth something." The next morning, instead of continuing southeast toward the settlement, they turned north toward the hidden spring. Elena rode behind Tom on Copper, her arms around his waist, and found herself noticing the steady rhythm of his breathing, the quiet confidence with which he guided them through increasingly rugged terrain. He was nothing like the loud, boastful men who had courted her in San Antonio, men who confused volume with strength and aggression with competence. The box canyon that contained the spring was a hidden paradise in the harsh desert landscape. Sheer red walls rose on 3 sides, creating a natural fortress accessible only through a narrow entrance barely wide enough for 2 horses to pass abreast. Inside, a small stream bubbled up from an underground source, creating a pool of clear water surrounded by lush grass and shade trees. It was exactly the kind of place that would appeal to men who needed to keep stolen cattle hidden while they built up their herd. There, Elena whispered, pointing to fresh hoof prints in the soft earth near the water's edge. And look at the grass. It's been grazed recently. Tom studied the signs with the careful attention that had frustrated his supervisors but now proved invaluable. You're right. They've been using this place regularly. He pointed to a sheltered area under an overhang where the remains of several campfires were visible. That's their base camp. They withdrew carefully, making sure not to disturb the scene or leave obvious signs of their presence. Once they were safely away from the canyon, Tom began planning his approach. This was his chance to finally succeed, to prove that his methods had value, but he knew he would need backup to handle 4 or 5 armed men. It'll take me 2 days to ride back to headquarters and bring help, he said, already calculating distances and timing. 2 days there, 2 days back, Elena agreed. What if they move the cattle before you return? It was the question Tom had been dreading. His slow, careful approach might finally pay off, but only if he could act quickly enough. I can't take them alone, he said. It would be suicide. Elena was quiet for a long moment, thinking, what if you didn't have to take them alone? Elena, no, I won't put you in danger. I'm not talking about a gunfight, she said calmly. I'm talking about strategy. You said they're not violent men, just practical ones. What if there was a way to separate them from the herd without a confrontation? Despite his concerns, Tom found himself listening. Elena had already proven her tactical insights were sound. What did you have in mind? Cattle are creatures of habit, Elena explained. They'll follow familiar paths, especially to water. If we could block their access to the spring, force them to move the herd to an alternate water source, we might be able to predict where they'll go. Tom considered this. There's another spring about 5 miles east, but it's in open country. No cover, no concealment. Exactly. If you were waiting there with help, you could take them without a fight. They'd be focused on watering the cattle, not expecting trouble. It was a brilliant plan, the kind of tactical thinking that might finally make Tom's patient approach pay off. But it would require Elena to help him block the canyon spring, putting her in potential danger if the thieves returned unexpectedly. I can't ask you to do that, Tom said. You're not asking, Elena replied. I'm offering. Tom, you gave me back my life when you found me in the desert. Let me help you reclaim yours. The emotion in her voice caught Tom off guard. Somewhere during their journey together, this remarkable woman had begun to believe in him in a way that even he struggled to believe in himself. The realization was both humbling and empowering. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Tom rode to the alternate spring to confirm it would work for their plan, while Elena gathered materials to block the canyon entrance. Her practical experience managing a ranch proved invaluable as she identified the best way to create a barrier that would keep cattle out while appearing natural enough not to immediately alert the thieves. That evening, as they shared a simple meal beside their small campfire, Tom found himself studying Elena's face in the flickering light. She had been abandoned as worthless, just as he had been written off as a failure, yet here she was planning a strategy that might finally make his career. The parallel wasn't lost on either of them. Why are you helping me? He asked quietly. Elena looked up from the piece of hardtack she had been softening in her coffee. Because you helped me first. Because you saw worth in someone others had discarded. Because you deserve to succeed. I'm not sure I deserve anything, Tom said. I've let a lot of people down. Have you? Elena challenged gently. Or have you just approached things differently than they expected? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Tom had spent so long accepting others' assessment of his failures that he had stopped questioning whether their standards were the right ones. My supervisor always says I think too much, act too little, he admitted. And yet your thinking led us to find their hideout, Elena pointed out. Your patience allowed you to understand this country well enough to predict their behavior. Maybe the problem isn't your methods. Maybe it's their expectations. As the fire burned low and the desert night closed around them, Tom found himself looking at his life from Elena's perspective. What if his careful approach wasn't weakness but wisdom? What if his failure to make quick arrests reflected not incompetence but a deeper understanding of the complexities involved in frontier justice? You see things clearly, he told Elena. Too clearly for your own good, maybe. Is that why your intended husband rejected you? Elena smiled ruefully. He wanted a decoration, not a partner. Someone who would make his house look respectable without having opinions of her own. When I suggested improvements to his business practices, he decided I was too forward. His loss, Tom repeated, and this time Elena heard the deeper conviction in his voice. Yours too, if you keep letting other people define your worth, she replied. The next morning, they implemented their plan. Elena positioned herself where she could watch the canyon entrance while Tom moved the materials into place to block the stream access. Working together with quiet efficiency, they created a natural-looking barrier that would force any cattle to seek water elsewhere. How long do you think we have? Elena asked as they finished. Hard to say. They might not come back for days, or they might show up this afternoon. We'll need to be ready for anything. They didn't have long to wait. Late that afternoon, the sound of approaching cattle drifted across the desert air. Tom and Elena concealed themselves in a position where they could observe without being seen, watching as 5 men drove a substantial herd toward the canyon entrance. The cattle, hot and thirsty after their journey, pressed eagerly toward the familiar water source only to find their path blocked. The confusion and milling of the animals quickly frustrated the thieves, who found themselves dealing with increasingly agitated livestock. "Come on," Elena heard one of the men call to his companions. "We'll have to take them to the other spring. These cattle won't settle without water." Tom squeezed Elena's hand, a silent signal that their plan was working. As the thieves reluctantly drove the herd away from the canyon, Tom began making his way toward the alternate spring, following a route that would allow him to reach the site before the slower-moving cattle. Elena's role was to wait, then follow at a safe distance to make sure the plan proceeded as expected. It was the most difficult part for her, watching Tom ride away to face 5 armed men alone, even though she knew he would have helped waiting. But Tom had sent a message to his fellow rangers the day before, and when the thieves arrived at the open spring with their stolen herd, they found themselves surrounded by lawmen who had been waiting patiently in concealment. The arrest was swift and bloodless, exactly the kind of successful operation that Tom's careful planning had made possible. When Elena arrived at the spring an hour later, she found Tom accepting congratulations from his supervisor, a gruff man named Captain Morrison who seemed surprised by the success of his supposedly incompetent ranger. "Outstanding work, Whitfield," Morrison was saying. "Clean arrest, recovered cattle, no shots fired. This is exactly the kind of professional operation we need more of." Tom caught sight of Elena approaching and felt his chest swell with pride, not just for the successful arrest, but for the woman who had made it possible. "Thank you, sir, but I had help." This lady provided crucial tactical insights. Morrison looked Elena over with the assessing gaze of a man used to making quick judgments. What he saw impressed him, a woman who looked like she belonged in this harsh country, who had clearly been through hardship but carried herself with dignity. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat. "Tom's told us how you helped plan this operation. Outstanding thinking." "Thank you, Captain," Elena replied. "Tom did all the real work. I just offered a different perspective." As the other rangers prepared to transport the prisoners and recovered cattle, Morrison pulled Tom aside. "I owe you an apology, Whitfield. I've been pushing you to work faster, make quicker arrests, but this operation shows the value of your approach. Patience and planning beat rushing in with guns blazing." Tom felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. "Thank you, sir. That means everything." "There's a permanent position opening up in Tucson," Morrison continued. "Better pay, more responsibility. Head of the Regional Investigation Unit. If you're interested, the job is yours." The offer was everything Tom had hoped for, validation of his worth and methods. But as he looked at Elena, he realized that his definition of success had changed. The job in Tucson would be a triumph, but it would also mean leaving behind the woman who had helped him discover his true capabilities. "Can I have some time to consider it?" he asked. Morrison nodded. "Take all the time you need. You've earned it." That evening, as they made camp beside the spring where Tom had achieved his greatest professional success, Elena and Tom found themselves facing an uncertain future. The arrest had proven Tom's worth as a ranger, opening doors that had been closed to him. For Elena, it represented a chance to start over, to build a new life free from the judgments that had constrained her in San Antonio. "You should take the position in Tucson," Elena said as they sat by their fire. "It's what you've worked for." Tom stirred the coals with a stick, watching sparks drift up into the star-filled sky. "Is that what you think I should do?" "I think you should do what makes you happy," Elena replied. "What feels right for the man you've discovered yourself to be." Tom looked at her across the fire, this remarkable woman who had seen his worth when others saw only failure, who had helped him succeed by believing in his methods rather than trying to change them. "What would make me happy is building a life with someone who understands that success isn't always loud or flashy. Someone who sees value in patience and planning and thinking before acting." Elena's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "That sounds like a very practical approach to happiness." "Elena Martinez," Tom said, rising and moving around the fire to kneel beside her. "You are the furthest thing from worthless cargo that I've ever encountered. You're brilliant and brave and beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with what other people think beauty should look like. Would you consider marrying a ranger who's finally learned to value his own worth?" Elena looked into Tom's kind eyes, seeing in them a future she had never dared hope for. A partnership built on mutual respect and understanding, a love that valued substance over surface, a life where her practical wisdom would be appreciated rather than criticized. "Thomas Whitfield," she said, reaching up to touch his weathered cheek. "I would be honored to marry a man who rescued me from the desert, and then let me help rescue him from self-doubt." They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Yuma, with Captain Morrison serving as witness, and the recovered cattle serving as an unlikely wedding gift from the grateful ranchers whose livestock Tom had returned. Elena wore a simple blue dress purchased with her share of the reward money, and Tom wore his best uniform, the badge polished to a shine that reflected his newfound pride in his work. The position in Tucson proved to be everything Morrison had promised. Tom's methodical approach to investigation was exactly what the territorial government needed as the region grew more complex and civilized. Elena became his unofficial partner, her insights proving invaluable in cases that required understanding of human nature and practical logistics. They built a small house on the outskirts of Tucson, with a garden where Elena grew vegetables and herbs, and a stable where Tom kept Copper and the gentle mare he bought for Elena. In the evenings, they would sit on their porch and watch the sunset paint the desert mountains in shades of gold and purple, two people who had found in each other the recognition and respect the world had withheld. Elena never again doubted her worth, and Tom never again questioned whether his careful, thoughtful approach to life and work had value. They had learned that sometimes the people others overlook are exactly the ones who understand what truly matters, and that the greatest successes often come not from force or speed but from patience, wisdom, and the courage to see worth where others see only failure. Years later, when Captain Morrison would tell the story of Tom Whitfield's greatest arrest, he would always mention the mail-order bride who had been abandoned in the desert and turned out to be the key to solving a case that had stumped the territorial rangers for months. It became a legend of sorts, the story of two people who had been discarded as worthless and proved that sometimes the most valuable treasures are found in the most unexpected places. The desert where Elena had been abandoned eventually bloomed after a rare spring rain, covering the harsh landscape with wildflowers that lasted only a few precious weeks before returning to dormancy. It was a perfect metaphor for the kind of beauty that emerges when conditions are right, when someone finally sees and nurtures what was always there beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to flourish. In quiet moments, Elena would remember that terrible day when she had been left to die in the wasteland, and she would marvel at how that moment of ultimate rejection had led to the greatest acceptance of her life. She had been called worthless cargo, but she had become the most treasured part of a good man's world. Sometimes, she reflected, the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing in disguise, the hard push that moves you toward the life you were meant to live. Tom would remember the years of frustration and failure, the constant criticism and doubt, and realize that every setback had been preparing him for the moment when his patience and wisdom would finally be recognized. He had been called a failure, but he had learned that success comes in many forms, and the kind that lasts is built on foundations of character rather than quick victories. Together, they had discovered that true worth isn't determined by others' opinions, but by the depth of one's character and the willingness to see value in what others overlook. In a harsh land that tested everyone who tried to make a life there, they had found not just survival but triumph, not just acceptance but love, not just success but the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you have finally found where you belong. What do you think about Elena and Tom's journey from rejection to recognition? Share your thoughts about finding worth in unexpected places, and let us know how their story resonates with your own experiences of overcoming others' limited expectations.